Hello once again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Bring On the Bad Guys, complete this time with some nefarious mood lighting, which throws a few more shadows into this show, which of course deals with villains from comic book history. Today we're looking at Daredevil villains that debuted against the Man Without Fear in the 1960s. So to qualify for this top 10 list, the villain had to have appeared against Daredevil in one of his own comic books in the 1960s. So, a surprising omission for some people may be the fact that Kingpin is not on this list, despite Kingpin first appearing in the 60s and being known as Daredevil's primary nemesis. That's because Daredevil and Kingpin actually did not meet until later on in comic book history. So, Kingpin's not featured here, but we do have 10 other villains who are some wacky, some not so wacky, some known, some probably not well known at all. So, before we get to that, one more thing I would call your attention to, and that is this outfit that I'm wearing is actually an outfit from the Daredevil Netflix show. This is the Nobu stunt double costume. So in the scene where Daredevil and Nobu are fighting in the abandoned warehouse and Nobu gets set on fire, this is actually the outfit that gets set on fire because it's fire retardant, and it's worn by the stuntman in that actual episode. So, little fun part of my collection which I wanted to share with all of you. It's also super cool. Fabric's really neat. Anyway, we're not talking about fashion today. We're talking about supervillains. So we will get right to that. With number 10, we have Leapfrog. Kind of a laughingstock of villains, actually. His real name is Vincent Patilio, and he first appeared in Daredevil number 25 in February of 1967. His origin is somewhere in the US. We're not really sure where. Best guess is somewhere in New York, perhaps New York City, or the surrounding area. He was created by Stan Lee, Gene Colan, and company that were working on the Daredevil issue at the time. And we get to the power scale now, which of course is 5 categories: personality, powers, mythology, design, and cultural impact. They're each ranked, each character is ranked a score of 1 to 5 in each category. So 25 is the highest score possible. Personality, powers, and design are pretty self-explanatory. Mythology is everything that happens on the pages of the comic books. Cultural impact is anything that happens off the pages, like video games, movies, animated shows, things like that. So Leapfrog, personality, all the way down at a 2. And that is because Leapfrog's always been known as a goofy villain and kind of a loser, where he would usually get caught fairly easily. His suit is very gimmicky in that it has springs that allow him to jump. His actually first few panels in the comics involve him jumping around an airport, kind of causing a nuisance without actually robbing anybody, without wearing his frog suit. And of course the frog suit looks kind of goofy as well, and he's run into Spider-Man a few times, so Spider-Man of course makes fun of him for that, of course. Powers 2. He doesn't have any superpowers. His suit is the source of all his quote-unquote powers, so he's not just walking around like a normal human being. At least he has the capability of jumping. Also, depending on how he has it configured, it can be used to swim underwater as well, and that can occasionally go along with a computer guidance system. Mythology is a 4, which you might think is pretty unusual for this character, and you'd be right, and that's because he has a really strong redemption story in the comics. Usually, he would take on either Daredevil or Spider-Man, and he actually helps Spider-Man take down a particular gang of super villains. Has a conversion, change of heart, whatever you want to call it, and he and his son kind of work together to get out of this very desperate situation they find themselves in. So it's a pretty solid story involving a character that is pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things. So mythology gets a 4. Design is a 2, and Of course, a frog outfit with springs on the bottom doesn't really rate high unless you're going for the zany look that the leapfrog unintentionally obtained. And cultural impact is a 1, as he has not appeared off the pages of the comic books. Leapfrog, pretty standard criminal career against Daredevil. Tried to rob people, tried to rob banks. Didn't really work out for him. Daredevil, Iron Man, Spider-Man always there to take him down. Moving on to number 9, we have Deathstalker, also known as the Exterminator, and that's Philip Sterling. He first appeared in Daredevil 39 in April of 1968, and his place of origin is Riverdale, New York, in the US of A. He was created by Stan Lee and Gene Colan, and Deathstalker, few different aliases throughout his career against Daredevil. His personality sits at 3. He's a criminal mastermind, very smart individual who doesn't always have the best supporting cast. So he first recruited the Animen, who all had different animal themes, so Ape Man, Birdman, Catman, Frogman, and animal-related abilities. They were pretty inept, and Sterling was not a fan of them and let them loose soon after setting them out against Daredevil. But always a schemer, very smart, very intelligent individual is Sterling. Powers 2. And to start off, he didn't really have any powers. Through some classic comic book accidents, he gained the ability to teleport and travel interdimensionally. He also has a suit that increases his strength. So enhanced strength would be a skill of Sterling. Mythology 3. He's got some interesting stories, although early in the 60s, when he first shows up, not really anything too complex or out of the ordinary for Daredevil, but he's got a few wrinkles, such as getting trapped in a blast of explosive type in a warehouse. And that blast, because it also contains some weird scientific gizmos that Sterling was working on, transported Sterling into an alternate dimension, and he had to figure a way out of there, which is where he changed the name. So he was known as Exterminator first, got caught in the explosion, came back, returned as Deathstalker. And he was kind of a semi-ghost when he returned, and his first point of order was to try to collect the pieces of technology needed to make him solid for long situations. For long situations, I mean the rest of his life. Daredevil didn't like that too much, usually took him down. Design 3. Deathstalker has pretty neat, mysterious get-up for a supervillain. The long cape works for him. The wide brim hat, although it can on occasion look a little off if he wears it white. If he wears it right, it's kind of a fun little calling card that he has. Cultural Impact 1 also has not appeared anywhere off the pages of the comics. Moving to 8, the Masked Marauder. And the Masked Marauder's real name is, of course, Frank Farnham. He first appeared in Daredevil 16 in May of 1966. He hails from the Big Apple, New York City. And he was created by Stan Lee, John Romita Jr., and Frank Giacola. Getting to his power scale, his personality is a 3, and that relies more on his chameleon-like personality to almost change who he is on a dime as a way of course, concealing his identity. He was actually one of Daredevil and Foggy Nelson's landlords. One of their early locations for their law offices was one of Frank Farnham's buildings. And they never suspected that he, of course, was the Masked Marauder. Powers are 2. And that's because he's a super smart guy, great inventor, master of disguise, but all his extra human powers come from his suit, which involves energy blasts on occasion and, of course, concealment. Mythology 3. So it's really interesting when you consider how successful the Kingpin versus Daredevil stories were later in Marvel history. Because for the first few years of Daredevil's comic series, there were a few people that tried to get the upper hand in the criminal underworld, and the Mask Marauder seemed to have the best chance. So I have to imagine in some alternate universe out there, Frank Farnham evolved into a Kingpin-like character that went on to really give Daredevil a hard time throughout his career. However, that's not the way history actually ended up. The Mask Marauder kind of decreased, and the Kingpin, of course, made his way up the ladder to become Daredevil's arch nemesis. Nevertheless, the Mask Marauder does have some interesting stories. He has always kept a solid stable of villains close at hand in contact. He has spent time with the Magia, allied himself with the Hood during the events of Secret Invasion, but he's never quite made it back to the heights that he had in the 60s when he first met the Man Without Fear. Design 2, and he gets that because his helmet isn't so bad, but he's got this almost cape-looking thing that goes over his mouth, and not a big fan. Doesn't look great. Not a good look. That's maybe a reason why he didn't attain the fame of Kingpin. And once again, he is another character that's never made it past the books of comics. We do have him down for a number 2 in cultural impact, in that he was one of the first landlords in the Daredevil Foggy Nelson picture that really caused trouble for them, in that we need rent now and that kind of aspect. Spider-Man is of course known for that, probably more than any other hero, but Murdock and Nelson and Murdock did run into some financial issues early, and that has, of course, made its way across into the Daredevil television show on Netflix as well. Next, we have the Jester, who really isn't as similar to Joker as you might think. His real name is Jonathan Powers. See, he's got a real name. Joker, we don't know his real name. We're already getting miles apart from these guys. Daredevil number 42 is his first appearance. That's from July 1968. He hails from Hoboken, New Jersey, of course not that far from the Big Apple. And he was created by Stan Lee and Gene Colan. His personality is a 3. And that is because he actually isn't much of a Joker knockoff. He can be cold and collecting and focused, and he's very smart. And I wouldn't call Joker stupid, but the Jester definitely has a talent for making very shrewd decisions. His powers are 2, and that is just because he's a very highly trained gymnast and acrobat, and he is very skilled at some forms of martial arts as well. So no real superpowers, but very, very skilled at his method of transportation, as you might call it, and combat. Mythology 3. And Jester's probably his most famous scam was he produced a bunch of fake newscasts involving a bunch of different things, the New York City police, Vietnam War, JFK's assassination, and that's something that is, of course, kind of relevant these days when we have such a barrage of different media and we don't quite know what is coming from. And the Jester was one of the first to really go for the confusion angle as far as a barrage of fake newscasts. And Also, something else that separates the Jester from the Joker is the Jester doesn't really have the grand schemes that the Joker has. He's very content to just focus on beating Daredevil and sticking around New York, more or less. Foggy Nelson's also come into the Jester's hit list, as you might want to call it, because of Foggy's job as the New York City District Attorney. Design is a 3, and the Jester doesn't have the face paint of Joker or other clown-themed villains. Very, very much sticks to the court jester type outfit with almost the Harlequin hat that you look at and the diamond kind of check pattern on the sleeves. Purple and green. Curiously, also the Joker's color scheme is a scheme the Jester has adopted. However, that's not the only colors that he will wear, which is another difference between him and the clown Prince of Crime. Cultural impact is 1 because, once again, the Jester has not, like the others before him, appeared on TV or video games or anything like that. So, that is the Jester. Number 6, we have the Fixer. And actually, yes, you'd be right when you say, didn't we talk about the Fixer before? And isn't the Fixer a lot different looking than that? And I'd say, yes, you're right, and also wrong at the same time, because this is actually the first Fixer that appears in Marvel Comics. This is Roscoe Sweeney, and he is the man responsible for the death of Daredevil's father, which is why he ranks in this list, because he doesn't really have a whole lot to do in the Marvel Universe outside of that. So his first appearance was back in Daredevil number 1 in February of 1964, and he's from New York City and was created by Stan Lee and Bill Everett. Personality is a 3. Very well known in the organized crime circuit, especially among the boxing community, in that he would fix fights. And very convincing, very kind of a jerk. That's just the best way to put it, but a very shrewd jerk. He always knew what buttons to push to get the boxers to agree to throw fights, to win fights, to sign on with his agency, etc. Powers are 1 because he's just a normal human being. Mythology is 3. That's primarily because, again, he is responsible for the death of Daredevil's father after he signed Daredevil's father, battling Jack Murdock, on as a representation. In the boxing ring, he told Murdock to throw a fight. Murdock didn't throw the fight, and the Fixer had him killed. So that is the Fixer's quote-unquote claim to fame. Hasn't really shown up in much of anything since then. That's about it. Design 2, pretty ordinary. Just a guy, dresses nice because he makes a lot of money. Nothing bad to say, nothing great, so we put him at a 2. Suits and ties, usual stuff. Cultural impact 3, and he actually has shown up in television shows. In a television show, I should say. Daredevil, of course, the Netflix series he shows up in. He also shows up in the Daredevil movie that starred Ben Affleck. That's the Fixer. And now we go to the world-famous Stilt Man, and by world-famous I mean world-famously laughed at. Stilt Man usually makes top 10 lists of absurd Marvel villains, but that shouldn't make you underestimate him. His real name is Wilbur Day. Wilbur, like the pig from Charlotte's Web, of course. He first appeared in Daredevil number 8, which was from June of 1965. He's another character on this list that comes from the New York City area, and he was created by Stan Lee and Wally Wood. His personality score sits at 3, and he started off as a pretty clunky character, but he has improved in that personality throughout the years, especially in his knowledge of how to deal with more powerful villains than himself and put himself to work for them. Powers 2, he's a normal human being, but he's got his bulletproof stilt suit, which gives him enhanced strength and, of course, the telescopic legs that are where the stilt comes from in his name. Mythology 3, and that is a lot of that is due to his famous unfortunate name and his really odd costume, which has never really looked smooth or suave in any way. So 2 birds with 1 stone. He gets a 2 for design. It's functional, not really cool looking though. Mythology 3, he's shown up quite a bit against people like Spider-Man, Iron Man, some of the Avengers, Black Widow, Falcon. So he's pretty well known, just not as a mastermind. And his story, actually he converted hydraulic ramming devices into his stilt legs, put him into the armored suit, and he also has rotated other weapons into that suit and tried to start a life of crime. Daredevil said, nah, took him down, and since that day, Stilt Man has teamed up with a number of villains, the Mask Marauder, Electro, Gladiator. He's also hired as a sort of mercenary or burglar from time to time. So he gets around. People know who he is. Cultural Impact 3. So the stilts on Wilbur's costume show up in the Daredevil Netflix show. They're just actually sitting in Melvin Potter's workshop. And he showed up very briefly in the 1990s Iron Man animated series. And if you played either Iron Man 2 or Spider-Man Web of Shadows on handheld devices as opposed to consoles hooked up to televisions, then he showed up in those as well. So he gets a 3 for cultural impact. Again, part of that also is because he ends up on worst comic book villains lists from time to time. Moving to number 4, we have someone that might surprise quite a few of you that are watching this. Star Saxon. Real name is Samuel or Sam Saxon, and he first shows up in Daredevil number 49 in February of 1969. He's from Memphis, Tennessee, and he was created by Stan Lee and Gene Colan. And Star Saxon, we give him a 4 for personality. He is one of the first Marvel characters to really work intensely. It's hard to describe this because I don't want to say first to work behind the scenes because that's not really true. But he threw Daredevil for quite a loop because he worked as himself behind the scenes, and he also kept taking on the names and guises of other villains that Daredevil had faced. So really kept Daredevil off balance in the late 60s and early 70s by using both robots and also costumes to make himself look like people like Mr. Fear, who was a Daredevil foe. And that was something that Daredevil had a very hard time solving, that problem, because of Saxon's skill at blending from one role to the next while also keeping his own aims in view. And he would also reverse engineer or simply steal things like Mr. Fear's fear gas, some robotic parts from various sources, and he rose the ladder of organized crime very quickly while also striking out on his own at the same time. Very clever villain. Powers are 3, and we'll get into that with his mythology here, which is also a 3. So when he was younger, Saxon discovered the remnants of one of Dr. Doom's Doombots in a subway, and that was where he had his introduction to robotics. And he started against Daredevil when he took up a mob contract to kill good old Hornhead. And so he created the robot to do it, unfortunately, the robot targeted the person who actually ordered the hit, Biggie Benson. So kind of a failure, if you look at it, killing your own employer. But Saxon wasn't deterred. He ended up discovering Daredevil's secret identity, kidnapping Karen Page, and getting away scot-free because he is quite the intelligent person. So that gets us to where he murdered the original Mr. Fear, took his costume, took his devices, became the second Mr. Fear, and also ended up defeating Daredevil in a hand-to-hand battle on one of the bridges in New York, which did not sit well with Daredevil, of course. It looked like he fell to his doom, much like Gwen Stacy would, but he would actually show up later calling himself the Machine Smith and would actually have to upload his consciousness into a machine type AI body. So a lot of twists and turns for Star Saxon. And that explains the mythology at 3 and also the powers at 4 or the powers at 3 in that he's constantly taking, and also he has his robot cyborg type body that he uses for some weaponry. Design 3, and of course he has in this picture the distinctive pseudo mutton chops and the flaming red eyebrows and facial hair and such. He gets a 3 because he generally sticks to a basic design. The Machine Smith cyborg body that he uses is more or less standard silver, so nothing great, nothing awful, just middle of the road, so a 3 there. And cultural impact 1, unfortunately, he has not appeared off the pages of comic books either. So that's Star Saxon, probably one of the characters that is not very well known, but ranks pretty high on this list as he gets a 14. Of course, a lot of these Daredevil villains don't end up with very high scores because there are not a lot of Daredevil villains from the 60s that are really famous these days. Moving to number 3, we have the Gladiator, aka Melvin Potter. He first shows up in Daredevil number 18, which first came out in July of 1966. He's another New York native, and he was created by Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. His personality score is 2. Not a very smart person. Intelligent, yes. Good at building weapons. Not the smartest tool in the shed, as you might put it. Very poorly. Powers 2. Very, very good weapons designer and armor designer, and he has a very strong knowledge of martial arts, but no superhuman powers, so he has to rely on the suit and his fighting prowess, so he sticks at a 2 in that department. Mythology 3, and he has a kind of a stereotypical origin story where he basically just decided that all these supervillains that weren't succeeding against the superheroes that took them down, he's like, I can do better than these people. So he decides to become a criminal just to show everybody that he could be as effective, if not more effective, than your standard supervillain. And actually, surprisingly, he was right, at least at first. He designed the armor, very lightweight, very mobile. The saw blades that he had on wrist mounts. He was actually recruited by the Mask Marauder, and then later by Electro, by the Emissaries of Evil, which was Electro's kind of gang, the Magia, Madame Mask, when she tried to take down one of Tony Stark's labs and failed, of course, with the Gladiator. But so he was very successful in creating a name for himself. He would work with Deathstalker, Zebediah Killgrave, the Purple Man, who we will talk about in a little bit. He reformed for a period of time, went back to crime, and has kind of shifted a little bit back and forth since then. But a very good goon character is the Gladiator, who also can hold his own because he has strong knowledge of, like I said, armor and weapon building, so doesn't have to rely on others. Design 3, the wrist-mounted circular saw blades was something new and doesn't necessarily translate great on the comic page, but the standard outfit that Gladiator wears is, of course, the gold yellow with the 3 diamonds, 2 diamonds and 1 diamond looking thing. Middle of the road, nothing great, nothing bad. That's 3. Cultural impact 4, because Melvin Potter actually is one of the main supporting characters in the Daredevil Netflix series. He's played by Matt Gerald in the Netflix series, and he actually works at certain points for both Wilson Fisk and for Daredevil, creating different armor and protective gear and weapons for both of them. So that's the Gladiator. Number 2 is the Owl. His real name is Leland Owlsley, and it's kind of a debate. He may be from New Jersey, maybe from New York, maybe from somewhere else. We're not 100% sure, but probably one of those places. He first appeared in Daredevil number 3 in 1964, and he was created by Stan Lee and Bill Everett. His personality sits at a 3, and that is because in his early life, he was a very well-known and liked Wall Street figure. So he did a lot of trading on the stock market, very well known as a genius, and then some of his backroom dealings came to light and was exiled. So the IRS, of course, strikes again, and that's what led the Owl to go to a life of crime and also attempt to enhance himself with superhuman powers. He gets a 2 for powers because he wasn't really born with any spectacular powers. He's able to glide some distance. He has developed some enhanced strength and reflexes. And he has also taken different serums and done different things to increase his hearing and eyesight to be more like the bird of prey that he is known as. So that gives his powers a score of 2. Mythology 3, no real great owl storylines in the comics, as he is not a character that's really carried large-scale stories. He has shown up in Age of Ultron and Age of Apocalypse. Some pretty significant roles in those 2, but not as a main character. He's, of course, taken on Black Widow, Kingpin himself, Fantastic Four, Daredevil, a lot of the street-level heroes in the Marvel New York scene. He's come into contact with Spider-Man, and he's been around the block. Design is a 3, and the Owl is one of those characters that sometimes gets a really cool design, sometimes doesn't really get a great design, especially in his early days, where he looks almost like a more rotund version of the Penguin at times, sometimes a sleeker version of the Penguin at times. So we give him a 3 because it just kind of varies a lot. And cultural impact for the Owl is 4. He shows up for like 2 or 3 seconds in an episode of the Spider-Man animated series from the 90s, and as a boss character in the video game based on that series. But more importantly, he is played by Bob Gunton in the first season of Netflix's Daredevil series. So that is the Owl. And of course, he is played very differently in the Daredevil series in that he does not have any superhuman powers whatsoever. He's just a very good numbers guy working for the Kingpin. And I do have to correct myself as I was looking back on this. I'm noticing I have Bill Everett listed here for some reason as a co-creator. It was Joe Orlando that actually was the artist behind the creation of the Owl. So that is an error. Also, the Owl should get credit for using the word milksop in his first line. Always a great insult, milksop. Number 1 may surprise some people. The Purple Man, Zebediah Kilgrave, first appeared in Daredevil number 4. And of course, the Purple Man is well known for being the nemesis of Jessica Jones, which we'll get to in a bit. And so that may be the reason that you might be surprised to see him here, but maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe you're all much more well-versed in comics than I think you are, which I haven't actually spent a lot of time thinking about, so let's just pretend this conversation never happened, you know? Kilgrave is from Croatia, over in Europe, and he was created by Stan Lee and Joe Orlando. And personality for Mr. Kilgrave sits at a 4, and he gets actually a pretty big assist in being an expert in psychological manipulation. Of course, his main power is that if he tells you to do something, you do it. But he's also a very smooth operator, very dapper, able to communicate easily with people and rub elbows with some very powerful individuals. And can't do that without having a bit of a silver tongue, which Kilgrave definitely has. Powers sit at 3. Limited hypnosis, as you would generally call it. Limited mind control, but it's basically he tells you to do something and you do it. His voice has a superhuman power that gets you to obey it. Design 3. Nothing really special about his outfits. He usually just wears what normal people wear, except in purple colors, and of course he has purple skin. So that is the Purple Man. And we get to, I'm going to combine mythology and cultural impact, kind of, because the Purple Man is a very interesting case story in that he, of course, is initially a foe of Daredevil, has a pretty decent run in the Alpha Flight comics that come across the publisher's floor a few years later. But it wasn't until 2001 when Alias came out, which was the Jessica Jones comic, that he really went to another level. And it's just a great example of the skill of writers taking a character that's really been not very well known for decades and just shooting him into, you know, the realm of a publicly acclaimed series like Alias, starring Jessica Jones. So that, of course, leads to the Jessica Jones Netflix show, where the Purple Man, who they just call Kilgrave, is played by David Tennant. He actually made it onto Rolling Stone's list of the greatest television villains of all time. And, you know, over 40 years after this character, you know, debuted, 50 years after this character debuted, he, shows up and gets his due. And this is a character, not like Magneto, where he was right there, X-Men #1, and was super famous this whole time. Very, very obscure character for decades until he gets his moment of limelight, or purple light, if you want to call it that. Of course, he's also shown up in the Avengers, Earth's Mightiest Heroes, and the 90s X-Men animated series. Not profound roles in either of those situations, but of course hadn't come up as a major character at those points. And of course, he is the #1 character on this list. Like I said, Daredevil, not a source of a lot of legendary or big name characters in the 60s. Kilgrave right here is at 17, which lands him the #1 role. So to review, we've got Leapfrog at 10, Deathstalker at number 9, the Mask Marauder at 8 with his goofy mask. The Jester sits at 7. The Fixer at 6. Stilt Man at 5. Star Saxon is number 4. The Gladiator, Melvin Potter at 3. The Owl at 2. And, of course, number 1, Zebediah Kilgrave, the Purple Man. So that is your top 10 Daredevil villains from the 1960s. We've actually only got one more 60s episode, and that's Avengers villains. So they will show up in the next episode, and then we'll see if we do more Marvel. We might dip into some DC just for a change of pace, but we have to do the Avengers first. So we will. Have a great night, everyone. Stay safe, and we will see you next time on Bring On the Bad Guys. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, all that fun stuff. See ya.